Okay, when you start with your needle and thread, a little trick. Most people will lick the thread and then put it into the eye. If you do it the other way around, you lick the eye, and it seems to attract the thread through. So try that out. It's a good little trick. When you're knotting the thread, just roll it around your finger, roll it forward. I don't always knot, depending on what I'm doing. If there's a fold to hide the knot in, I will, because sometimes this can irritate people. Mostly I will just do a little tight stitch. Maybe come from underneath so you don't see the tail. And you just do little tiny tight stitch. That's not going anywhere. Do your whatever stitch you're going to do. And then when you come to the end, again, just do a little tiny couple of threads, one or two, twice. And that's not going nowhere, it's nice and flat. And you can bury, if you've got layers, bury your thread underneath the layers, through the layers. And then snip. And you lose that, and you just got a nice flat stitch line. Don't make your threads really long, because it tends to knot. So a way around that is, if you use beeswax, just run your thread lightly through the beeswax, and then with your hand to warm it up, make sure it's not like lumps or anything on it, and it heats it up and goes into the thread. This will stop it knotting. Make sure you check before you stitch on your fabric, so you've got a fine silk or something. Sometimes when you run through, if you put too much wax on, it can gather up on the fabric. And depending on what wax you use, get yourself a real beeswax. It costs a little bit more, but it's worth it. It will last years. It's nicer, more organic. If you use the cheaper ones, they're like mixed varieties. I think it's like paraffin wax and mixed with beeswax. They're not so nice, and they tend to, bunch up, and I don't like them. So invest in a bit of real beeswax. Get in the habit of using thimbles. These are the two I use. This is a tailoring thimble. It's got a hole in the end. I prefer it. It gives you some air circulation. And I tend to use the side of my finger. Some stitches I will use the end, so I'll switch to a full thimble. Get in the habit of using these, because they'll save your fingers. Because when you start doing lots of sewing and you get holes in your fingers, it can get really sore and take a long time to heal. A little trick, you got a new thimble, I bash it on the side with a hammer, and it gives you a slight oval, and it fits your finger nicer. Whereas if it's round, it tends to, well, on mine it does, it pushes on the side, because I've got quite big fingers. So yeah, get in the habit of using thimbles. There's lots of other types of thimbles. There's leather ones, rubber ones, little metal ones that just wrap around your finger. Just have a little go at different ones, and you'll find which ones you prefer. So my preference is these two, mainly this one, the tailoring one. Yep. Okay, seam finishings. So when you make up your seam, you want a nice edge so it's not all fraying. So different ways that you can finish the seams is overlocking. You can see it better on the black. This is the preferred way. It contains all the fraying and makes it look nice. If you don't have an overlocker, you can zigzag. So if you use a wider zigzag, maybe a 4 or 5, depending on the weight of your fabric. So you'd have to do a little trial run and see what looks nice first. And bump the stitch length up, maybe 2. Try 2 first, and depending on the fabric again, you can go up or down. So zigzag, and when you zigzag, you let the outside edge drop off the edge, and then it binds around the edge. You can straight stitch along the edge. So with a number 2 stitch, if it's a fine fabric, if it's a little bit heavier, you might have to go up to a 3. And just stitch along the edge, and it'll only fray up to the stitch line. That's another way of doing it. Or the old-fashioned way, pinking shears. You can use pinking shears, which are these with the little teeth, and cut the edge. That's your seam finishings. So this is a flat felled seam. You see it a lot on jeans. It's a way of encasing the raw edges, and it makes a strong seam because it's double stitched. So how you create this: stitch up your normal seam allowance, and then if you cut one side down, the underneath side down, and I usually cut that just slightly under how wide I want my flat fell to be, and then you can use it as a guide. And then you fold the top over the edge. Make sure you've got a good turn, but it's not gonna buckle like too much. If it's too much, trim it down. Don't have a tiny little bit like that, because it's really awkward to get a nice neat edge. So have a good turnover. So we've turned it over, you lay it down and top stitch, and then this is what you get. So that's a flat felled seam. So a double seam, you see this on, like lightweight fabric summer dresses, so the fabric's delicate. So if you stitch up a normal seam, and then right beside it, I don't know, about 4 or 5 millimeters, do another line of stitching, and then the raw edge you can overlock off. This gives you a stronger seam, and if the first one splits a bit, you've got the security of the second one to back it up. So that's a double stitch seam. So this is a French seam, and you do it on really delicate fabrics like chiffon, organza, really light things like silks. And it's a way of encasing the raw edges, because if you try overlock fabric like this, the overlocker will just chew it, and then you see an ugly overlocking stitch through the fabric. So this is the best way to deal with fine fabrics. So first you stitch up on a number 2 stitch from the front, so the front of your fabric. Stitch up a number 2 stitch, and then you trim it down really close, and then you iron it forward. So like this one's been ironed forward, so you iron it this way and iron it flat, so you can just see through the shadow of the seam allowance there. And what you want to do is then stitch just this side, so you don't have anything peeping out through. So stitch down just that side, and then you get this. And then on the inside, on the outside, sorry, you don't want to see anything peeping through. And then you just iron it to one side, and it helps when you press it if you slightly pull it straight as you press it, and that will give you a nice neat seam. the herringbone stitch, you start off, you work from, if you're right-handed, you work from left to right, doing a back stitch in a zigzag form. The person using a left hand would go from right to left and work their way back that way. So the herringbone stitch, you've hemmed your skirt or whatever you're doing. Usually we'll have in theatre we'll have a 2 to 3 inch hem allowance, so that gives you room to play in case you've got to let it down. And in this case I've overlocked the edge. You could turn it in depending on what you're doing. So in this case I've overlocked the edge, and what you do is you back stitch in a zigzag formation. So on the main body of the skirt or on petticoat, you just pick up 1 or 2 threads, so it's just like a pluck mark, and then you zigzag down and you do the same back stitch, but you're just picking up the fold, and you can pick up a bit more fabric here because it won't be seen from the front. And then go up, zigzag again, 1, 2 threads, and see it's crossing over there, so it's kind of knotting. Yep, back stitch, zigzag, back stitch. So that's a herringbone stitch. Don't pull it too tight, but don't leave it too loose as well, just happy medium. And when you want to finish off a stitch, I prefer to just do a couple of little tiny, you can start and finish like this, just a couple of tiny tight stitches. That's going nowhere, and then just bury the thread in between the layers. So I just go in between, and then I just trim it off, and then you don't see the thread hanging. It looks neat. Yep. Herringbone stitch. So a slip stitched hem. In this hem you would fold the raw edge down, so fold it down and fold it up, making sure you got 2-3 inches there. And then if you're right-handed, I flip it round, and I'm going to work from right to left. And for this one I would start with a knot, so roll it round your fingers, roll forward a few times, and then use your nail to pull it so you get a knot. And then I'd catch that under, coming out in my crease. And it helps if you don't iron a really hard crease here. If you just finger press it, it's easier because you're gonna slip along within this crease and then come out and pick up a thread or 2 on the main body. So if you don't iron a really hard line, it makes it easier. You can get your speed up quicker. So start off, so picked up the 1 or 2 threads, and then I go back up where I come in from, and I slide along that crease, and then go down and just on the main body pick up a thread or 2. Yeah. And then back up where I come out, slide along, go down, pick up a thread or 2. Back up, slide along, pick up a thread or 2. If you want, you can go slightly forward and you'll see a little diagonal stitch. So a lot of people do it that way. Either or is fine, whatever you like. So you're just slightly going forward and you just see a small diagonal stitch. So yeah, you see the stitches there. If you're left-handed, you'd work from left to right, doing the same thing. And that's a slip stitched hem. So when you look on the other side, all you're going to see is just a slight pluck mark. If you use the same color thread, you wouldn't even notice that. Don't pull it too tight, because then you will see the line of it. Just keep it softly, but not too loose. Slip stitched hem. So this is a frayed hem. What you do use this on is like shawls, and it works best on wool and stuff, like a loose weave. But what you would do, decide how long you want your fringe. I've done a number 2 stitch across, and then you just start pulling the threads out. Let me get hold of one. So it would be quicker with a looser weave. And then just work your way up to the stitch. And I find if you've got a lot to do, if you carefully cut up, don't cut across the grain, cut up between 2 layers, and you do shorter bits, it's a little bit easier. That's a fringed hem. Right, to make a curved hem, what happens when you try to do a curved hem, you hem it up and there's too much fabric. So you need to gather in that fabric to keep the curve. So if you do the large stitch on your machine, don't lock at the beginning or end, about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, it's probably about 4 millimeters, 5 millimeters. Do a stitch along the edge, and then the depth that you want your hem to be, normally about 1/2 an inch, 1.5 centimeters, depending on the thickness of your fabric, how deep you do it. The deeper you do it, the more bulk you get, so keep it narrow. And what you do is separate the top threads from the bottom and just pull the bottom thread on this first gathering line and gather it up. Gently gather it up. And then you can see it just naturally turns up. So distribute it evenly. And you can use that secondary line, that's your little guide line. You don't want to go past that. And you would press it. So pressed it up, I'm just leaving that, turning it in so you can't see it from the front. And make sure you're pressing straight up, don't like to the angle that way. So this is it turned under, so I've turned it up once and then under again. So you could finish it like this and then do it at a stitch along the edge, or you could leave it flat and do a herringbone stitch, or if you prefer you could put bias banding along that edge. Just make sure you press it straight up, not to the side, and if you turn it over you can see it's dealt with the bulk. Be careful, don't press from the top, because you'll leave all ridge marks, and you might, on some fabrics, the creasing might show through. So always press from behind very delicately and just use the tip of your iron. Overlocking that edge, if you overlock it, Like this one's been overlocked, it's not good. It adds too much bulk and you can see it through, so it's not a good idea to overlock, because it gathers and then it adds a lot of bulk. So you're best keeping it like that, and then you can herringbone it down, or else if you wanted to do that with the bias binding, your choice. That's a curved hem. So a face curved hem is another way of dealing with a curved hem. So if you have the length of your fabric, and it's an idea if you leave, when you're cutting it all out, leave a good 3 inches extra than what you would need, 3-4 inches. And then when you come to do the hem, you can just trim it off, cut it off to where you think it should be. And what you do with the excess that you cut off, turn it over and bring it up. And then you will machine stitch it along the edge. Like this. So you've machine stitched along the edge, you've pinked out, and then you can turn it inside out. Like that. And you will end up at this stage. So you've got your hem, and then you don't have all the bulk showing through. When you press this, it's an idea, if you can you see the lip there? If you slightly roll it back and press, so you've got a slight little lip, and that way you don't see, if you look at the edge, you won't see the 2 layers of fabric. So it just looks like you've turned up the one. If you like, you can just herringbone that, or if you want, you can overlock the edge or zigzag, however you prefer to finish it off, then herringbone it down. So this is more of a modern hem. You see this a lot in wedding dresses and things like that. So that's your curved faced hem. So bias bound hem. So what you do is turn your hem up, however deep you want it. This is about 3 inches. And I've got my bias binding, and just on the folded edge, the one that's turned up, I've stitched along the edge. I've opened up the bias binding on one side and machined it in the crease to the edge. And then I just flip it up, come along and slip stitch it along there. So start for a rolled hem foot. On the edge, just do a couple of stitches, and then hold the tails, and you can use the tails and you can start feeding the fabric round. So you've got hold of the tails, the fabric's already started into the little curly bit. And you can start stitching, so holding your tails for support. Don't pull too hard. And if you keep your fabric to the left as it rolls round, it tucks it under and stitches it. That's your rolled hem foot. And the other side. So you feed the fabric into the rolled part. You can see the little roll of the hemming foot, and you feed the fabric into that. And what it does as you go along, it curls it under and top stitches it. So you need to keep your fabric at this angle to the left, not too much and not too little. too much, it'll start buckling, and you can see it just folds it round. And you would machine stitch it. So for a hand rolled hem, if you do a pre-stitch line a few millimeters away from the edge first, and then press it on the stitch line, maybe 3-4 millimeters, and then press it up. And press it up so your stitch line slightly rolls up and away from the edge. So you can't see it from the front, and if you look directly on it, it's just slightly below the lip. And then what you do is with a single thread, just before the line here, you just stitch, pick up 1 or 2 threads, and then go into the stitch line or the crease, your choice. And you kind of create like a zigzag, a bit like the herringbone but without the back stitch. Into the thread. You don't have to put the stitch line, but it does help sometimes to keep your line straight and give you a little bit of support. And then when you've done about 5 or 6 stitches, you pull your thread and it pulls it round. You get a nice rolled baby hem. You can press it at this stage. On this cotton I could press it, but if you've got a delicate fabric like chiffon or organza, just hold the iron over it and steam it and finger press it down. If you look at the other side, you're just seeing a small pluck mark. You're just seeing a small pluck mark, and if it's in the same color you won't even notice it. Baby hem. Okay, this is a machine hem done on the sewing machine. So what you do is you turn up your fabric, fold it under, and then you roll up the hem, flip it underneath, so you get this little lip happening. And then what you will do is come along with your sewing machine on the hemming foot, and it will stitch about 4 or 5 stitches and then do a zigzag. And this zigzag, just the point of it will catch your fabric. So if you carry on down your foot, so you're stitching on the lip, and the zigzag catches on the fold. And then when you put it to the front, you just see these little catch marks. So if you did that in the same colored thread, you wouldn't see that. Yeah, so that's a machined hem. I would use this, you could use it for curtains. You see modern trousers will be sewn like this. I'd only use it in an emergency, maybe on a petticoat. If I was in a real rush, I might whack the petticoat on like that. So that's a machine hem. So I did it on a number 3 stitch.